Yeah, let's unpack this. Imagine, if you will, the sheer, breathtaking grandeur of Versailles. Picture the sprawling palace, its gilded halls shimmering under, the glow of 1,000 candles, the meticulously manicured gardens stretching just as far as the eye can see. And at its center, the Sun King himself, Louis XIV. He's embodying absolute power, a symbol of unparalleled royal authority, magnificent in its scale and, well, meticulously controlled in every single detail. It's such an iconic image, isn't it? A testament to an age of opulence and, well, absolute monarchy. But what happens when human nature, with all its complexities, its desires, its secrets, what happens when that pushes back against that absolute ironclad control?
Well, what's truly fascinating here, if we kind of zoom in, is the sheer scale of the public spectacle that Louis XIV's reign actually was. His rule wasn't just about, political governance, it was a performance, meticulously designed for omniscience and control, life at Versailles. It was this elaborate, almost theatrical choreography. Every move, every gesture, pre-scripted for public consumption. Yet this very rigidity, this constant unyielding display of power, it inherently created a profound disjuncture, a deep, unsettling gap between the public persona and the private reality. It genuinely begs the question, what was truly happening behind those gilded doors, beyond the all-seeing gaze of the Sun King and his court?
And that, my friends, is exactly our mission today. We're embarking on a deep dive into what you might call Versailles After Dark. We're going beyond the official chronicles, past the powdered wigs and the formal bows, to explore the intimate realities, the truly unconventional desires, and, the shocking scandals that simmered just beneath that glittering facade of 17th century France. Our sources for this journey are quite fascinating, actually. We'll be pulling from vivid historical accounts, candid personal memoirs, intricate details of court etiquette that reveal surprising insights, and even legal documents that expose some pretty dark undercurrents. They collectively offer a nuanced, sometimes startling perspective on this pivotal period. So consider this. How could a court so rigidly controlled, where every single aspect of the king's life was a public ritual? How could it also be a hotbed of clandestine relationships and surprising, even scandalous behaviors? That's the core paradox we're wrestling with in this deep dive.
Indeed. The prevailing narrative of Versailles often focuses just on its unparalleled grandeur and its role as a political instrument, designed to tame a rebellious nobility. But our sources really challenge that simplistic view. They highlight that the very intensity of this public performance may have inadvertently fostered a desperate need for private outlets. The constant pressure to conform outwardly, to adhere to an impossible standard of decorum, it didn't eliminate unconventional desires. Quite the opposite, actually. It simply drove them further into the shadows, making them more secretive, more elaborate, but no less potent or prevalent. It's a classic pressure cooker scenario.
That's a crucial insight. It really makes you wonder if the king's control was less about moral purity and maybe more about something far more pragmatic, like ensuring political loyalty and maintaining an ironclad social hierarchy. As long as these private behaviors didn't overtly threaten his authority or cause some unmanageable public scandal that would unravel the court, maybe they were, in some surprising ways, tolerated. It's almost as if the public spectacle, the dazzling performance of royalty, was this grand, elaborate distraction, masking the intimate realities that were constantly unfolding behind the closed and often very gilded doors of Versailles, like a kind of trade-off. Public obedience for private indulgences, provided they remain truly private.
That's a really interesting way to frame it. The facade was everything.
So let's step inside this gilded cage, if you will, and truly explore how Louis XIV meticulously built this system of control. And crucially, where the cracks inevitably began to show. His deep, almost visceral distrust of the aristocracy. It was firmly rooted in the tumultuous, frowning rebellions of his childhood. I mean, imagine being a young king, witnessing your capital city besieged, your own family forced to flee, all at the hands of powerful, unruly nobles. This formative experience absolutely fueled his ambition to centralize all power in his own hands. Versailles, in essence, became the physical embodiment of this control. It was a magnificent, glittering, gilded cage where nobles were compelled to reside, which ensured their constant presence, their financial drain, and ultimately their utter dependence on the monarch.
Right. And this wasn't just about making them show up. The court's etiquette was far more than just a collection of polite social graces. It was a meticulously designed, sophisticated system of political control. Every single action, from the most mundane daily task to the most elaborate ceremonial ritual, it was choreographed to demonstrate deference to the king. It relentlessly reinforced a rigid social hierarchy. A single misstep, even something seemingly trivial, could lead to severe social and political disgrace. The stakes were incredibly high because your very existence, your access to royal favor, depended on performing your part flawlessly. This was, well, social engineering on a grand scale.
And when we say minute details, we really mean it. The rules governed everything, from the truly grand to the utterly absurd almost. For instance, if you wanted to announce your presence at a door to the king's chambers, you didn't knock. Oh no, that was far too common. Instead, you were expected to delicately scratch at it with your fingernails. Bizarre, right?
It is. And think about who could sit in the presence of the king. Only women, and even then, only at night during specific social functions. Men, regardless of their rank, stood. Always stood.
Wow. And expressing emotion. Forget about it. Courtiers absolutely could not show emotion until the king himself had shown emotion first. These seemingly trivial rules, they really underscored his absolute authority over even the most personal human behaviors. They were constant, subtle reminders of who was truly in charge.
The dress code, too, was a critical and often financially crippling instrument of this control. Courtiers were required to wear the exorbitantly expensive robe de cour, and they had to adhere to very specific, constantly changing attire for various formal events. This wasn't just about fashion. It was a deliberate, cunning strategy to keep them perpetually financially indebted to the king.
Makes sense.
If you were constantly spending your family's fortune on lavish clothes, jewelry, wigs, just to maintain your place at court, you were far less likely to be able to amass enough wealth to fund any sort of rebellion or opposition. It was a brilliant, if cruel, form of economic subjugation.
And the red high heels, I heard about those.
Yes, the coveted red high heels. They weren't just a style statement. They were specifically restricted to nobles of the right bloodline, those with confirmed aristocratic lineage. They served as a highly visible marker of status and, more importantly, royal favor. They literally elevated those who wore them, both physically and socially.
The king's daily life, as you mentioned earlier, was just this continuous, exhausting public performance. From the elaborate lever ceremony in the morning where he'd symbolically rise with the sun, surrounded by hundreds of courtiers vying for the immense privilege of handing him his shirt.
Incredible.
To the coucher ceremony at night when he retired for the evening. These rituals were attended by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of courtiers, all of them desperate, almost literally for proximity, for a glance, for any opportunity to gain his favor.
Even seemingly mundane activities like meals, council meetings, strolling through the gardens or hunts, they were all integrated into this grand spectacle, constantly emphasizing the king's centrality and the courtiers' subservient performing roles. It was an ingenious system for channeling all ambition towards him.
And this constant need to show their faces at court was absolutely essential for survival, right? For advancement.
Absolutely essential. Our sources tell us the king never granted requests of those that didn't show their faces at his court. This explicitly highlights that access to the king, his attention, his mere acknowledgement. That was the ultimate currency. Courtiers actively fought, schemed, and spent exorbitant sums for the chance to attend these rituals.
Just for a glance.
A fleeting glance, the privilege of handing him a garment, walking alongside him for a moment. These were highly valued, almost tangible commodities. This system deliberately fostered intense competition, deep insecurity, and an almost pathological level of sycophancy among the nobility. Their energies were thus expertly diverted from any potential political opposition towards internal rivalries and constant flattery, ensuring the king's unchallenged authority.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Imagine you're living in this pressure cooker. You're constantly performing, under constant watch, your every move scrutinized, just to exist within this system. What do you think that does to people? Does it just crush their individuality, forcing them into a mold? Or does it push their desires underground, making them even more potent, maybe even more desperate for an outlet?
Right.
And Louis XIV wasn't just relying on public performance either. He maintained an extensive, sophisticated network of spies and talebearers to monitor everything. Their private lives, conversations, potential intrigues. Nothing was truly private.
Exactly. This pervasive surveillance ensured that any deviation from expected behavior or any perceived disloyalty would be swiftly reported, often by their supposed friends or even family members.
So what does that do to people psychologically?
Well, connecting this to the bigger picture, this relentless pressure would almost certainly lead to a profound disjuncture between one's public persona and their private reality. And the most feared punishment for an infraction wasn't necessarily execution or imprisonment, though those happen. It was social exclusion. The king's choice not to see or acknowledge a courtier, effectively treating them as if they didn't exist, that was considered a fate worse than death.
Wow.
It stripped them of status, access, and potentially their entire livelihood. This demonstrated the immense psychological power Louis wielded. He ensured compliance through the existential fear of social and political ruin.
So the unconventional behaviors we're going to talk about,
Yeah.
maybe they were a necessary release.
Yeah. Could be. A psychological release from this constant vigilance, a way to reclaim a sliver of personal agency. Or perhaps a covert means to assert a hidden self in defiance of the imposed conformity, the omnipresent fear of being unseen. It would breed paranoia and hyper-awareness of social cues. And that inevitably leads to highly secretive behaviors, the total opposite of the public display.
Right, let's pull back the curtain now on the king's private world, venturing beyond the crown's shadow, because this too had immense ripple effects. While his public life was this grand choreographed performance, Louis XIV's intimate world was equally complex, starting with his marriage. His union to Maria Theresa of Spain in 1660 was, well, it was a political arrangement, pure and simple.
Absolutely. Quintessential 17th century politics.
Designed to solidify peace between France and Spain after the Treaty of the Pyrenees, ending decades of conflict. This dynastic alliance really underscores the main function of royal marriages back then, securing political stability, advantageous alliances, often with little regard for personal affection.
Right. But despite this official, rather transactional union, Louis XIV was famously known for his extensive extramarital affairs, and these were often conducted with a remarkable degree of openness at court, which is a testament to the unique moral code that often applied to the monarch. Our sources indicate he possessed a strong appetite for women and a real eye for the ladies. He had at least 18 known mistresses and fathered 15 illegitimate children.
15. And they weren't hidden away.
No, that's what's particularly noteworthy and quite unique for the time. Many of his mistresses attained a kind of semi-official status and wielded significant influence within the court. And furthermore, the legitimization of the king's illegitimate children and their integration into royal society, that was a distinct feature of Louis XIV's court. Very different from many other European monarchies where such children were often kept in the shadows.
It's truly fascinating how normalized and accepted this was within the aristocracy. The presence of royal mistresses, even married ones, was just part of courtly life, an expected fixture almost. And it wasn't purely about passion, was it? There was this deeply pragmatic, almost mercenary undercurrent.
Oh, absolutely. Husbands of royal mistresses frequently gained significant rewards, prestigious titles, elevated social standing, all through their wives' connections to the king. It demonstrates a deeply transactional element to sexuality within the elite. Personal desires, relationships, they were intricately linked to political ambition and social advancement.
So self-interest often trumped fidelity.
It suggests that, yes, self-interest and a desire for power often superseded traditional marital fidelity, creating a kind of courtly currency out of one's spouse.
That's why.
Precisely. The king's mistresses, they produced legitimate heirs for their own family sometimes. They served as companions to the king, and crucially, they could act as intermediaries for courtiers seeking royal favor. The explicit mention in sources that husbands of noble women were willing to look the other way for potential rewards if their wives became royal mistresses. That's profoundly revealing.
It really is.
It illustrates how women's bodies and relationships, even those seemingly driven by passion, were often instrumentalized. Pawns in the larger high-stakes game of courtly power, influence, and dynastic continuity. This transactional aspect starkly highlights a divergence from conventional moral expectations. Personal gain could thoroughly trump what we might consider marital sanctity. It's a stark reminder that what was permissible for the king and his immediate circle often diverged wildly from the expectations placed on the wider populace.
And this wasn't some hidden shame. Louis XIV was apparently quite open about his infidelities. His mistresses often held official positions at court, sometimes even living in apartments connected to the king's own. Like Louise de la Vallière, his first major mistress, known for discretion and maybe genuine affection.
Right.
Or the flamboyant and extravagant Madame de Montespan, who had prestigious apartments and huge influence.
Immense influence, for a time.
And later, there was the devout conservative Madame de Maintenon. She became his confidant and secretly his second wife after Maria Theresa died.
That's right. This suggests that while formal religious doctrine and societal norms officially condemned adultery, the reality of court life, especially for the monarch and the elite, operated under a different, far more permissive code. This open secret normalized a certain level of sexual nonconformity at the very top. It created a dual standard that undoubtedly influenced the broader sexual mores of the aristocracy, where maybe discretion was valued more than strict monogamy.
Now, Beyond his romantic entanglements and dynastic stuff, Louis XIV also harbored some truly unusual personal preferences. And these, maybe surprisingly, also had significant ripple effects. He had what our sources describe as a weird fetish for watching women give birth.
Yes, that's a documented peculiarity.
His desire for a better, uninhibited view of the process reportedly led him to promote the reclining position for childbirth.
Before this, women often gave birth in a more upright, sometimes squatting position, which many argue is actually physiologically better, but that's another story.
Right. But what's fascinating is that this courtly preference, driven by the king's personal peculiar interest, subsequently spread from the court to the lower classes, and it became the standard practice for centuries.
It truly raises an important question, doesn't it? How much of what we consider normal or conventional today, practices we barely question, might have originated from the personal whims or peculiar preferences of powerful figures in the past? The king's personal life, even his seemingly bizarre preferences, weren't just private quirks.
No, they clearly had impact.
The fact that his preferred birthing position began to spread is a direct causal link. A fascinating example of how royal trends could trickle down. This illustrates how the monarch's personal preferences, no matter how unusual or seemingly inconsequential, could set powerful precedents. They could even influence broader societal norms and practices.
So if the king did it, it became acceptable, or at least visible enough to spread.
Exactly. The king's behavior, whether intentional or not, could effectively normalize certain acts within the court and beyond. It profoundly shows how the unconventional could become an accepted part of the social fabric, fundamentally challenging the idea of a uniformly pious or conventional society that many imagined 17th century France to be.
It's wild, isn't it? Even in this tightly wound, hyper-controlled, performative public world, people found ways to express themselves, to connect, and even in some cases to create whole secret societies around these unconventional desires. It wasn't just hidden, it was often subtly reframed, almost intellectualized, sometimes even, weaponized in a way. Yeah. What stands out to you about how these desires manifested, particularly beyond the king's own immediate sphere?
Well, this truly challenges simplistic narratives of historical sexuality. It reveals a much more complex and nuanced landscape than we often assume. For instance, Louis XIV's own younger brother, Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, famously known as Monsieur, he stands out as a prominent, almost flamboyant example of open homosexuality or bisexuality within the royal family.
Monsieur, right. I've heard he was quite a character.
Oh, very much so. He was known for his effeminate presentation, often wearing women's clothing, adorning himself with ribbons and makeup, and he openly maintained numerous male lovers throughout his life. His eccentricities were well known, even celebrated in certain circles.
And what's truly remarkable is the surprising royal tolerance shown towards him, given Louis's own views.
Exactly. Despite Louis XIV's personal detestation for sodomites, which was well documented by his confessor and courtiers, he largely turned a blind eye to Monsieur's behavior. This was less about personal acceptance, probably, and more about pragmatic tolerance, driven by familial ties and political realities.
He couldn't really afford to alienate his own brother.
Pretty much. The king reportedly sighed, "Where am I to begin? My own brother," when urged by his confessor to purge sodomites from court. This clearly illustrates the practical limits of absolute moral authority when confronted with close family and a desire for dynastic stability. Monsieur was too important, too embedded, to simply dismiss.
So Monsieur's household became like a known center for this.
Precisely. It became a recognized center for male same-sex relationships, a kind of unspoken hub for what was otherwise officially condemned. His enduring romance with Philippe, Chevalier de Lorraine, was particularly well documented and widely known. Their Parisian mansion was even colloquially known as the Hôtel de Sodome among court insiders.
Hôtel de Sodome, wow.
Which indicates just how public, or at least how much of an open secret, these private affairs truly were. It wasn't entirely secret. It was a known reality, managed through a mixture of willful blindness and pragmatic acceptance at the highest levels of power.
And it wasn't just Monsieur, right? There were others.
No, beyond Monsieur, historical accounts also indicate the presence of other prominent male courtiers, including powerful military generals like Louis-François de Boufflers, Duke of Huxelles, and Louis-Joseph de Bourbon, Duke of Vendôme. They were known for their same-sex preferences and relationships. These weren't peripheral figures. They were crucial to the functioning of the state.
But what's truly intriguing, and quite startling, is the utilitarian view of sexuality that emerged in some circles. You mentioned Louis XIV's Minister of War, Louvois.
Yes, Louvois. His reasoning was purely, brutally pragmatic. It cut straight through any moral or religious arguments. He stated it was better for His Majesty than if they loved women, for when they have to go to war and battle, we couldn't detach them from their mistresses, while if they have other inclinations, they would be quite ready to leave the ladies and go on campaign with their male lovers.
That's astonishingly practical and cynical.
It reveals a striking, almost cold, utilitarian view of sexuality. Military effectiveness and state interests could override deeply held moral or religious censure. The king's personal disapproval of sodomy stood in stark contrast to his pragmatic tolerance of his brother's open homosexuality and the same-sex relationships among key military leaders. This powerfully demonstrates that the king's absolute power allowed him to selectively enforce moral codes based purely on political utility and the perceived indispensability of certain individuals.
So the rules didn't apply equally.
Not at all. The unconventional behaviors of the elite were thus not simply ignored, but actively managed and even leveraged within the power structure. Preserving state interests could thoroughly override deeply held religious doctrines. It demonstrates a profound cynicism at the heart of the absolute monarchy.
And it gets even more organized, almost institutionalized, within certain aristocratic circles. Around 1678, this fascinating secret society of adolescent lords emerged, including Guillaume Comte de Guiche, who was apparently an intimate of Monsieur and a notorious figure himself.
Yes, the Brotherhood, as it was known. It had statutes explicitly mandating total abstinence from women, a formal rejection of heteronormative expectations within their closed circle.
A secret society with rules.
Absolutely. This brotherhood wasn't just a casual group. They wore a specific badge depicting a man literally trampling a woman, a vivid symbol of their commitment. Furthermore, they engaged in elaborate ritualistic initiations where candidates were visited by grand priors to, quote, guarantee that their bodies are sound and can support the austerities.
Austerities. A euphemism, I assume?
A pretty clear euphemism for ensuring physical capability for their chosen sexual practices. Members were permitted to designate a partner in pleasure, indicating organized, formalized, and explicit same-sex activity within this elite circle. It's a remarkable testament to how individuals, even under intense scrutiny and official condemnation, carved out intricate, defiant spaces for their desires. They created their own counterculture within the gilded walls of Versailles.
And the language they used to describe these relationships, it's also incredibly telling. By 1686, the term péché philosophique, or philosophical sin, emerged as slang for sodomy.
Right. This sophisticated term directly associated sexual nonconformity with Enlightenment intellectualism and a certain level of refined thought.
So it wasn't just sin, it was philosophical sin.
Exactly. It suggests a sophisticated cultural attempt within elite circles to intellectualize or aestheticize what was officially condemned. By calling it a philosophical sin, or even le beau vice, the beautiful vice, it offered a veneer of sophistication. Perhaps a subtle challenge to traditional religious views, making these relationships seem less about base sin and more about a chosen, perhaps even intellectual or refined, preference. This provides a more nuanced understanding of how such behaviors were perceived, discussed, or obscured, and indeed integrated within elite court culture. It allowed them to exist in plain sight, just veiled by euphemism.
Now, while male same-sex relationships are quite explicitly detailed in our sources, they even have names in secret societies, there's a notable absence of similar explicit documentation for female same-sex relationships within the 17th century French court. It's almost like they simply didn't exist in the historical record in the same way. It creates a frustrating gap for us looking back.
It really does. And this disparity might reflect several interconnected factors. First, there were profound historical biases in documentation. Male authors often focused on male behaviors, particularly those involving powerful men. Second, there was the deeply phallocentric nature of early modern sexuality. Sexuality was largely understood and defined through a male lens, often making female same-sex acts without a phallus involved, less visible, less categorized, or even unrecognized as sexual in the dominant discourse of the time.
So they just didn't count it.
In some ways, yes. Or perhaps female same-sex acts were perceived as less threatening to patriarchal structures and dynastic continuity compared to male sodomy, and thus were less policed or recorded. This suggests that female unconventional behaviors might have been even more deeply hidden and less visible in the historical record than male ones, making them much harder for us to uncover and understand today.
Beyond these explicit relationships, other intimate expressions and peculiar preferences existed within courtly life too, like corset inserts, busks.
Yes, busks. Rigid corset inserts, often made of wood or ivory. They evolved into intimate tokens of affection during courtship in 16th and 17th century France and England. These were literally worn against the body, holding the corset rigid.
So they became love tokens.
Exactly. Surviving busks often bear exquisite carvings, inscriptions, or even poetry, revealing deep erotic connotations and expressions of desire. Some inscriptions even anthropomorphize the object, allowing the busk to speak for the lover's longing or to highlight its prized intimacy with the female body, having been so close to the wearer.
And women had agency here.
Absolutely. What's important is that women weren't passive recipients. They had considerable agency. They could accept or reject these gifts, and they could actively express their own desire by giving men their busk points, the sharpened ends of the busks. It highlights a complex interplay of material culture, courtship rituals, and surprisingly direct expressions of personal desire within an otherwise rigid social structure.
And finally, aphrodisiacs. They were common.
Not uncommon, apparently. Especially coming to light during the infamous affair of the poisons, which we'll get into. Madame de Montespan, the king's long-standing mistress, was, for instance, notoriously accused of purchasing and using them to maintain the king's favor, supposedly to keep him enthralled.
Oh.
Even everyday popular beverages, like hot chocolate, which was a favorite at Versailles, were appreciated for their purported aphrodisiac virtues. This indicates a pervasive undercurrent of desire and a willingness to explore means of enhancing it, even if they skirted official morality. It all paints a picture of a society where the pursuit of pleasure and power were often inextricably linked.
Okay, now let's really delve into the shadows and scandals that truly rocked Versailles, threatening to unravel the very fabric of the court. The infamous affair of the poisons. This was a major murder scandal that erupted between 1677 and 1682. It implicated numerous prominent members of the aristocracy in shocking charges of poisoning, witchcraft, and the even more blasphemous practice of black masses. It sent shockwaves through every level of society.
It really did. The scandal's terrifying reach extended into the innermost circles of the king's court, causing widespread alarm, even for Louis XIV himself, about potential poisonings within his own entourage. The investigation was triggered by rumors of inheritance powders, a chilling euphemism for poison and various potent aphrodisiacs being sold by a clandestine network of fortune tellers, alchemists, and dark practitioners operating on the fringes of Parisian society. It was a terrifying revelation for the elite. Suddenly, their closest associates could be considered mortal threats.
And the investigation was led by this police chief, Lorraine.
Gabriel Nicolas Lorraine, yes. A remarkably shrewd and tenacious investigator. What he uncovered was a vast, terrifying network of individuals involved in the sale of toxic substances and the provision of occult services. Catherine de Chaise-Monvoisin, famously known as La Voisin, emerged as a central, almost legendary, and deeply sinister figure in the affair.
La Voisin.
She was deeply implicated in providing poisons, powerful aphrodisiacs, and most shockingly, arranging and facilitating black masses.
Black masses. What did that actually involve?
Well, according to the testimonies, these weren't merely rumors. They were blasphemous rituals involving the desecration of consecrated hosts, often featuring a naked woman serving as an altar upon whom grotesque sacrifices, sometimes even allegedly involving infants, were performed.
Oh my God.
These horrific practices were allegedly employed by desperate courtiers seeking to gain or maintain influence with the king, secure love from an indifferent paramour, or chillingly, to eliminate rivals through dark magic and actual poison. It showcases the extreme lengths to which people would go for power and favor within this intensely competitive environment, blurring the lines between superstition and cold-blooded murder.
And perhaps the most shocking implication of all was Madame de Montespan, the king's own mistress.
Yes. La Voisin, during her harrowing interrogations, often under torture we should remember, named Montespan as a key figure involved in these dark practices. She claimed Montespan had purchased aphrodisiacs to keep the king's affections, and more damningly, had participated in black masses with a defrocked priest named Etienne Guibourg, all with the explicit aim of securing and maintaining the king's favor over rival lovers.
The idea that the king's own beloved mistress could be involved, it's almost unthinkable.
Absolutely. But crucially, our sources explicitly state that there was no evidence beyond her confessions. La Voisin's confessions likely extracted under duress to substantiate these damning claims against Montespan. Despite the gravity of the accusations, she was consequently never formally brought to trial.
But it still had consequences for her.
Definitely. The shadow of the scandal, a bad reputation, irrevocably followed her. She was slowly but surely edged out of court life, eventually retiring in 1691. This points to the immense pressure and fear surrounding these accusations, even for those at the very top. and the king's delicate balancing act between maintaining his public image and dealing with explosive internal threats.
The scandal deeply personally affected Louis XIV, didn't it?
Yeah.
Leading him to become significantly more suspicious, more restrictive.
Yes, it truly marked a palpable shift towards increased moral scrutiny within the court, particularly as the king aged and embraced a more pious, almost austere lifestyle. The special court established to investigate these cases, the Chambre Ardente, or burning chamber, known for its ruthless prosecution and often torturous interrogations related to witchcraft and poisoning. It was ultimately abolished in 1682, effectively shutting down the public inquiry.
Why abolish it if the problem was so widespread?
Well, the king's decision to abolish the Chambre Ardente because he could not risk the publicity of such scandal is a critical point. It reveals the pragmatic limits of his seemingly boundless authority. He had to manage public perception. He had to prevent the widespread discrediting of the nobility, including, as we've seen, his own mistress and numerous high-ranking officials.
It was too big to handle publicly.
The scale of the accusations threatened to undermine the very legitimacy of his court and create an atmosphere of widespread paranoia and distrust. Thus, some unconventional behaviors, even heinous crimes, were tolerated or strategically suppressed, not necessarily out of moral conviction, but out of sheer political expediency. It reveals the pragmatic and sometimes deeply cynical nature of power at Versailles, where maintaining the facade was often paramount.
It's a stark reminder that even absolute power has its limits, especially when it comes to controlling the narrative and the dark undercurrents of human ambition. The pursuit of power at Versailles was so intense, the competition so fierce, that people would resort to the most extreme, illicit, and sometimes terrifying means imaginable. This entire affair is like a dark, disturbing mirror, reflecting the immense psychological pressures of court life and the lengths to which individuals would go to secure their place, or even just survive in such a demanding environment. So we've seen the king's absolute power, the intricate etiquette, the shocking scandals. Now let's explore the broader societal and ecclesiastical views on what were deemed unnatural acts, and crucially how reality often diverged sharply from these strict, rigid rules. The Catholic Church, obviously the dominant religious authority, held a staunch and uncompromising position against any sexual acts deemed non-procreative or unnatural.
Absolutely. Sodomy was consistently condemned as a mortal sin and a crime against nature. Theological arguments, notably from Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, were instrumental in linking condemnations of homosexuality to the concept of natural law. He posited it as an abuse of sexuality second only to bestiality. But what's vital to understand is that this category of sodomy was, as our sources say, utterly confused. It was remarkably broad in its application.
It wasn't just about same-sex acts.
No, it encompassed a wide range of non-procreative acts: oral sex, anal sex, masturbation not exclusively or even primarily, same-sex ones. It was a theological catch-all for anything outside of procreative marital sex.
And these weren't just theological condemnations. There were severe legal penalties attached, right?
Oh, yes. By the 11th century, sodomy was increasingly regarded as a serious moral crime, carrying terrifying penalties like mutilation or even death. For instance, in 13th century France, sodomy could result in brutal castration for a first offense, dismemberment for a second, and the horrifying punishment of burning at the stake for a third.
And for women.
Lesbian behavior, though often less explicitly documented in legal codes, was also subject to specific mutilations for the first two offenses and burning for the third, if caught and prosecuted. These were truly grim realities for those deemed transgressors.
But was it actually enforced consistently?
Well, that's the crucial distinction. The enforcement of these laws was far from consistent or universally applied. Prosecutions for same-sex activity were not universally common, particularly for women, partly perhaps due to the prevailing belief that female homosexuality didn't prevent them from bearing children to legal husbands, which was a primary concern for patriarchal societies.
So if it didn't disrupt inheritance?
It might have been seen as less of a threat. And despite these stringent condemnations, historical evidence suggests homosexual behavior was widespread throughout the Middle Ages and continued into the early modern period. The very discussions of sins by theologians and confessional manuals indicate that some practices were indeed occurring with frequency. Our sources highlight that individual cases of homosexuality were often overlooked in day-to-day life in the earlier Middle Ages, implying a significant, often unspoken gap between official doctrine and lived reality.
This inconsistency is truly telling. So for the 17th century French court, while religious and legal prohibitions were certainly in place, elite culture found ways around it, using fancy language.
Exactly. Elite culture, influenced by burgeoning humanism and intellectual currents, developed sophisticated ways to express same-sex desire. They employed euphemistic language, terms like péché philosophique or philosophical sin, and even le beau vice, the beautiful vice.
It sounds almost like an intellectual game, a way to signal sophistication while doing something forbidden.
It absolutely does function that way, and it's a brilliant insight into how power and privilege could bend official morality. This stark contrast between severe condemnation and widespread, often tolerated, practice reveals that moral and legal frameworks were not uniformly applied. Unconventional behaviors existed not just despite the rules, but often within the cracks of their inconsistent enforcement, particularly for the powerful elite.
So pragmatism won out over piety.
Often, yes. This suggests that the crime against nature was often secondary to pragmatic concerns like political stability, military utility, or strong familial ties, as we saw with Louis and Monsieur. The king's absolute power allowed him to prioritize these pragmatic concerns over strict adherence to religious doctrine, effectively creating a system where justice was often tailored to maintain the existing power structure. The nuanced language and selective enforcement further complicate a simple homophobic or promiscuous label for the era. This reminds us that historical realities are often far more intricate, contradictory, and profoundly human than initial surface-level impressions suggest.
It really makes you wonder about that constant, often jarring gap between what society preaches and how people actually live, especially when power is involved. It's not about judging historical figures from our perspective. It's about understanding the complex web of human behavior under extreme pressure. The combination of rigid court etiquette, intense competition for royal favor, pervasive surveillance, and the king's selective tolerance. It created an environment ripe for what we might call a shadow economy at Versailles, a vibrant, illicit marketplace of human desires and forbidden practices.
That's a great term for it. This shadow economy traded in illicit services, like the poisons and aphrodisiacs we saw during the affair of the poisons. It also trafficked in forbidden relationships, such as the same-sex liaisons among the nobility and unconventional practices from the king's peculiar childbirth viewing preference that reshaped medicine to the intimate exchange of personalized busks. This indicates that these unconventional behaviors were not merely random acts of deviance or simple moral failings. Instead, they often served a functional purpose within the court's unique social and political ecosystem. They were tools, whether for personal gratification, social advancement, or even sheer survival, that operated outside or on the fringes of official morality. A necessary pressure release valve, perhaps, in a world of absolute control.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, what we've discovered about Louis XIV's court at Versailles is this profound paradox. It was, without question, a masterclass in public image and absolute control, a meticulously constructed facade of unparalleled grandeur. Yet beneath that glittering surface, it simultaneously fostered a vibrant, often transgressive private life. The very strictures of public life, the relentless pressure to conform, they often created a desperate need for private outlets, leading to this profound dichotomy between outward conformity and deeply hidden desires.
And this deep dive truly challenges simplistic narratives for the era. It highlights the significant, often shocking gap between official doctrine and lived realities. The intimate aspects of Versailles remind us that even in periods of strong religious and monarchical authority, human sexual expression was incredibly diverse, adaptable, and often found ingenious ways to manifest despite official condemnation. The documented existence of secret societies, the widespread use of euphemistic language for same-sex relations, and the instrumentalization of relationships for social gain all point to a nuanced reality that defied simplistic moral categorization. It reveals the complex, messy truth of human nature under pressure.
Indeed. The unconventional behaviors we've explored from Louis XIV's court weren't merely isolated incidents of personal deviance. They were deeply interwoven with the very mechanisms of power, social climbing, and survival within that highly competitive and hierarchical environment. The historical record, though often biased and incomplete, offers these tantalizing glimpses into a court where sexual mores were far more complex, fluid, and contradictory than official doctrine suggested. Ultimately, Versailles After Dark was a realm where the relentless pursuit of power, the expression of personal desire, and the intense psychological pressures of constant public performance converged. It created this unique environment of both enforced conformity and pervasive, albeit covert, transgression.
This intricate interplay truly reveals the multifaceted dynamics that shape the Sun King's reign. It offers a richer, more human understanding of this iconic historical period. It urges a deeper, more empathetic historical inquiry into all eras, really, not just Versailles, by looking beyond the grand narratives to the individual human experiences that shaped them.
So, as you go about your day, maybe consider this. How do societies, even those that seem incredibly rigid and ordered, develop intricate shadow economies of behavior? Where do the pursuit of power, personal desire, and psychological pressures converge to create a reality far more nuanced and human than any history book often portrays? What might be the unconventional desires or hidden realities operating just beneath the surface of our own seemingly ordered modern world? Something to think about.